Ashes of the border. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of gunfire. In the heart of what once had been the border between two nations, a new settlement rose from the ruins, a place called New Haven County. It was supposed to be a symbol of rebirth, a promise of coexistence. But promises made by politicians mean little to those who have buried their sons. The wind still carried the scent of smoke and metal, and the ground, even months later, was soft with the ashes of the dead. The Westons were among the first to arrive. John Weston had been a mechanic before the war, a man who fixed broken engines and broken fences, who laughed easily and loved his daughter more than anything. Now his hands shook when he held a wrench, his laughter was gone, and his wife, Margaret, spoke only when necessary. Their little girl, Emma, was 9 years old, too young to understand borders, but old enough to recognize hate when she saw it reflected in her father's eyes. 2 houses down the dirt road lived the Kareems, Yusuf, Layla, and their 12-year-old son, Amir. They were refugees from the other side, survivors of bombings and famine, people who had seen the worst and still carried the mark of it on their faces. Yusuf had once been a teacher. Now he built walls for a living, and each brick he laid felt like a way to keep the world out. Layla prayed quietly every night, not for peace, but for strength. Amir was different. He watched everything with a strange mix of fear and curiosity, as if trying to understand why people who looked so much like him could hate him so deeply. The first weeks in New Haven were like a ceasefire, fragile, temporary, charged with tension. People spoke in short sentences, nodded without smiling, avoided eye contact. The markets were split down in visible lines, one side for the locals, one for the foreigners. Even the children learned quickly where they were welcome and where they were not. Emma walked to school every morning past the Kareem's house. Sometimes she saw Amir sitting on the steps, reading from a torn book. She never said a word to him, but she stared a little longer each day. He noticed but said nothing. Their parents had told them enough to fill the silence between them. When the first fight broke out, it was small, 2 men arguing over a water pump that served both ends of the street. By nightfall, the argument had spread like fire through dry grass. The locals accused the refugees of stealing. The refugees accused the locals of hoarding. Someone's window shattered. Someone's dog went missing. The next morning, John Weston found a crude message painted on his fence. Trader's Town. He didn't know who had written it, but he had his suspicions. Yusuf had passed by earlier that evening, and in John's mind that was proof enough. That night, when a thunderstorm rolled over the settlement, John stood at his window and watched Yusuf's house through the rain. He told himself he wasn't angry, just watchful, just careful. But beneath that lie was a pulse of hatred, steady as a heartbeat. In the dark hours before dawn, a windstorm tore through the valley. It wasn't unusual for that time of year, but no one had expected it to last for hours. Trees bent and snapped, roofs lifted, and the old power lines that had been hastily repaired after the war came crashing down. By morning, New Haven was a maze of debris. The Kareem's roof was gone. The Weston's barn had collapsed. People wandered the muddy streets in shock, calling out names that had no answer. The air smelled of wet ash and fear. For 3 days there was no power. The only light came from the fires that refused to die out completely. 8 trucks were supposed to arrive from the capital, but none came. The radio tower had fallen. The road was flooded. They were alone. John Weston and Yusuf Kareem met again by the well, the only source of clean water left in the town. Yusuf was filling a bucket when John approached, his boots sinking into the mud. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The tension between them was like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. When the bucket slipped from Yusuf's hand and splashed water onto John's coat, the silence broke. Harsh words were exchanged. They didn't even sound like language anymore. Just noise, pain, grief turned to rage. Someone nearby tried to intervene, but the 2 men were already swinging fists, slipping in the mud, falling and rising again. It wasn't about water. It was about everything that had come before. Dead sons, burned cities, broken faith. By the time others pulled them apart, both men were bleeding. Margaret Weston stood at the window of their house, watching her husband stumble home. Layla watched from the porch as Yusuf wiped the blood from his lip. Neither woman spoke. They understood too well that words could do more damage than silence. That night, the storm returned, louder, angrier. The people of New Haven huddled in their homes, praying their roofs would hold. Emma lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. She could hear her parents arguing in the next room, whispers that sounded like threats, like fear disguised as love. Somewhere beyond the wind, she thought she heard a child crying. In the morning, the streets were worse. Entire sections of the settlement had been flattened. The church's bell tower lay in pieces across the main square. The school's roof had caved in, and beneath the rubble people were trapped. Emma followed her father outside, the sky still gray and heavy. John didn't see Yusuf at first, but when he did, their eyes met across the ruins. There was no time for hatred. A scream came from what used to be the bakery. Together, without thinking, they ran toward it. They found a woman pinned beneath a fallen beam. She was neither local nor refugee, just another survivor. Yusuf lifted one side of the beam. John pulled the woman free. Their hands met for an instant, covered in blood and dust. No words were exchanged, but for the first time neither man looked away. By evening, the settlement was quiet again. Smoke rose from the ashes of the bakery. The rescued woman lay wrapped in a blanket outside her home. Yusuf sat on the steps, staring at the ground. John stood by the fence, watching his daughter feed their only chicken. The world seemed smaller now, smaller and more fragile. The border that once separated their nations was gone, but the one inside their hearts remained. And far beyond New Haven, beyond the broken hills and the rusted train tracks, the sky glowed red again. The war was over, they said, but nobody really believed it. The days that followed the storm blurred into one another. Smoke, hunger, cold, the endless sound of hammers trying to rebuild what the wind had stolen. New Haven felt less like a settlement now and more like a graveyard still pretending to be alive. The air had a metallic taste. Every sound seemed louder, sharper. A nail hitting wood, a door slamming, a child crying in the distance. People spoke in whispers, afraid that loud voices might summon another disaster. The Weston's barn remained in ruins. John salvaged what he could, stacking warped boards and twisted metal beside the house. His hands bled freely, but he didn't care. Pain meant focus. Pain meant he didn't have to think. Margaret brought him coffee in the mornings, set it beside him without a word, then walked back inside. The silence between them had become its own kind of language. Across the muddy road, Yusuf rebuilt his roof. He had help from two other men, both refugees, both quiet and thin. They worked fast, avoiding eye contact with anyone passing by. When the hammering stopped, they disappeared inside like ghosts. Only Amir seemed to step out, curious about everything. He wandered the road sometimes, looking at the wreckage, picking up stones and bits of glass, as if trying to understand the new shape of his world. One afternoon, as the sun struggled through the clouds, Emma found a piece of fabric tangled in the fence, bright blue, embroidered with gold thread. It didn't belong to anyone from her side of town. She looked around, saw Amir standing a few yards away, and held it up. He froze. Neither moved for several seconds. Then Emma placed it carefully on the fence post and walked away. When she glanced back, the fabric was gone. The next morning, someone found the church burned. The roof had caved in overnight, leaving only the bell twisted in its frame. People gathered around the ruins, whispering. The locals blamed the refugees. The refugees blamed the locals. Nobody had seen anything, but everyone had an opinion. John Weston stood in the crowd, his jaw clenched. He looked toward the Karim's house. Yusuf was already there, watching from a distance with that same cautious stillness he always carried. Their eyes met again, not as men, but as reminders of everything that had been lost. By noon, the rumors had spread. Someone said they saw Amir near the church the night before. Someone else said the boy was carrying a lantern. Margaret heard it in the market and felt her stomach tighten. When she told John, his face hardened in silence. That evening, John cleaned his rifle for the first time since the ceasefire. He told himself it was for protection, that things were getting dangerous again, but deep down he was waiting for a reason. Any reason. The following day, a group of men knocked on Yusuf's door. Their leader, a man named Briggs, had once been a soldier under Weston's command. He carried himself like a man who missed the war. He accused Yusuf of hiding supplies, of stealing from the common stores. Layla tried to reason with them, but Briggs pushed past her. They searched the house, found nothing, then overturned furniture just to leave a mark. Amir stood frozen, his small fists clenched. Yusuf said nothing until they left. When the door finally shut, he turned to his wife. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Layla look away. "They will not stop," he said. Across the street, John watched everything. He didn't join Briggs. He didn't stop him either. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She heard noises, not wind, not rain, but movement. She crept to the window and saw Amir sneaking across the road with something in his hands. Curiosity replaced fear for a moment. She waited until he disappeared behind the school building, then slipped on her boots and followed. The sky was moonless. The ground glistened from melted frost. Emma moved quietly, staying in the shadows. She found Amir kneeling by a broken fence, placing small pieces of bread wrapped in paper along the ground. A moment later, 2 stray dogs limped out from the darkness and began eating. He sat there, whispering to them, his voice soft and tired. Emma didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, kindness or maybe guilt. Something human. She watched until he left, then walked home slowly, unsure of what to feel. By morning, the news had spread again. The aid trucks had been ambushed outside the valley. Supplies lost, drivers missing. New Haven was on its own indefinitely. Fear turned into anger. Anger needed a target. Briggs gathered his men in the square, demanding that the refugees hand over whatever food they had stored. He said it was for fair distribution. No one believed him, but no one dared challenge him either. Not openly. John Weston stood at the edge of the crowd, silent. Yusuf stood opposite him, his face unreadable. Briggs shouted something about loyalty, about purity, about who really belonged. John felt every word like a hammer on his chest. He looked at Yusuf and saw not a man, but a mirror of his own anger, the kind he didn't want to admit existed. When the shouting stopped, Yusuf turned and walked away. Briggs followed with his eyes, then spat into the dirt. "They'll never learn," he said. That night, a fire started in the Kareem's garden. It burned fast, too fast, consuming a shed full of tools and blankets. Layla screamed, her voice cutting through the wind. Yusuf tried to douse the flames with water from the well, but it was useless. By the time anyone arrived, the garden was ash. The next morning, Yusuf found footprints in the mud near the fence, boots larger than his own. He said nothing, but his eyes were red. He rebuilt the shed in silence, one plank at a time. Emma watched from her window, guilt twisting in her stomach, though she had done nothing. She didn't know who set the fire. She only knew that the world around her was shrinking, neighbors turning into enemies, friends into strangers. Even the birds had stopped singing. On the 5th day after the fire, another storm warning came. The radio crackled faintly before dying completely. The sky darkened to the color of bruised steel. People ran to secure doors and windows, but the wind arrived before they could finish. This storm was worse than the first. It tore through New Haven like something alive. Houses crumbled, trees fell, and the river swelled until it swallowed the main road. The air was filled with dust, rain, and screams. Emma clung to her mother as the roof shook above them. John shouted orders, trying to keep the door shut against the pressure. Then a sound split the air. Not thunder, but wood collapsing. A section of the roof gave way. Emma screamed. John grabbed her and pushed her under the table. Outside, Yusuf was fighting to keep his own door from blowing open. Layla and Amir huddled beneath a blanket. When the window shattered, Amir ran toward it, trying to block the hole with a sheet of metal. Yusuf shouted, but the wind drowned him out. The sheet tore from Amir's hands and disappeared into the storm. Then the screaming started again. But this time it wasn't theirs. It came from the Weston house. Yusuf didn't think. He ran. He crossed the road against the wind, each step a battle. The air was filled with flying debris, wood, glass, the ghosts of 1,000 broken things. When he reached the porch, he saw John trying to hold up a fallen beam with his shoulders while Margaret pulled Emma free. The wall behind them groaned and leaned forward. Without speaking, Yusuf moved beside John and took part of the weight. For a moment their eyes met again, the same hatred still there, but buried under something stronger: instinct, survival, humanity. Together they pushed the beam aside, dragged the table over Emma, and braced the doorway until the shaking stopped. When it finally did, the silence that followed felt unreal. Rain dripped through the gaps in the roof. The air smelled of mud and smoke. John looked at Yusuf, chest heaving. No words, only a slow, uncertain nod. Yusuf nodded back, then stepped into the rain and vanished into the gray. By morning, the storm was gone. The world outside was wrecked again. But for the first time, when John saw Yusuf across the road, he didn't look away. He still hated him. But beneath the hatred, something fragile had begun to move. Something like understanding, though neither man would ever say the word aloud. And somewhere between them, in the wreckage of their broken town, the first seeds of humanity waited quietly beneath the ash. The storm left more than destruction behind, it left silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that hung over New Haven like fog over a graveyard. The radio towers were gone. The power lines tangled like veins across the mud. People wandered aimlessly, checking for survivors, searching for something to fix, something to believe in. The Kareem's roof had collapsed again. The Weston's barn was now a crater. Half the settlement had no clean water. The rest had no hope. For 3 days, there were no arguments, no fights. Just exhaustion. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone has already lost too much to keep shouting. Then Briggs returned. He had cuts across his face, a bandage wrapped around his hand, and eyes that burned with purpose. He gathered the remaining men in the square, the same men who used to salute John Weston during the war, and told them what they wanted to hear, that the refugees were taking what was left, that they had to protect what's ours. John didn't go. He stayed home, sitting by the window, watching the smoke rise from the center of town. Margaret tried to speak, but he just shook his head. "It's starting again," he said quietly. "Same war, different uniform." That night, the Kareems heard voices outside. Low, drunk, angry. Yusuf grabbed his son and pulled him close. Layla whispered prayers under her breath. The voices grew louder. A rock shattered their window. "Go back where you came from," someone yelled. Another rock. Then another. Yusuf opened the door and stepped into the cold. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't shout. He just looked at the men, Briggs and 2 others, standing at the fence. "We've lost the same things you have," Yusuf said. "We are not your enemy." Briggs smiled, cruel and empty. "You people were always the enemy." The words hit harder than the stones. Before anyone could move, John Weston appeared at the edge of the road. He was holding his rifle, the same one he had cleaned days ago. The wind carried his voice across the distance. "That's enough, Briggs." Briggs turned, half amused. "You finally decided to pick a side, Captain?" John's jaw tightened. "I already did." The tension cracked like lightning. Briggs took a step forward. John raised the rifle, not to shoot but to warn. The other men hesitated, uncertain. Briggs laughed, spat into the mud, and walked away. But the damage was done. The next morning, the Kareem's door was marked with red paint, a crude X. Layla tried to wash it off, but the stains spread deeper into the wood, like blood that refused to fade. By the 3rd day, food was running out. The well had gone dry. The aid trucks were still missing. The town split in 2, locals and outsiders, neighbors and ghosts. Emma snuck across the road again. She carried a small tin of beans from her mother's pantry. She left it on the Kareem's porch and ran back before anyone could see. The next morning, Amir knocked on her window. He held a small wooden bird in his hand, carved roughly from a piece of scrap wood. He placed it on the sill and whispered, "Thank you," before disappearing into the fog. Emma stared at the little bird for a long time. Its wings were uneven, one broken, one whole. Somehow it looked more alive than anything around her. Meanwhile, Briggs was building something far darker. He and his men patrolled at night, lighting torches, whispering about cleansing. John warned them to stop. They ignored him. One night, Margaret found a note nailed to their door. "You stand with them, you burn with them." She wanted to leave. John refused. "If we run now," he said, "there'll be no one left to stop them." The next night, the fire came. It started near the old mill, spread fast through the dry wood, and crept toward the Karim's home. By the time the alarm bell rang, it was too late. Flames climbed the walls like claws. Yusuf ran inside, shouting for Layla and Amir. He found them trapped in the back room, smoke curling around their heads. The door was jammed. He threw his shoulder against it again and again until it splintered open. Outside, the wind howled. Sparks leapt across the road. John arrived moments later, coughing, eyes stinging from the smoke. Without a word, he ran into the fire beside Yusuf. Together, they pulled Layla out, then Amir. The roof collapsed behind them, sparks flying into the night like dying stars. When it was over, half the town was gathered around the wreckage, faces lit orange by the flames. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than the smoke. Briggs stood at the back of the crowd, his torch still burning. John turned toward him. For the first time since the war, he raised his rifle, not as a warning this time. "Put it down, Briggs," he said. Briggs sneered. "You're protecting them?" "I'm protecting what's left of us," John said. Briggs laughed once. "There's nothing left of us, Captain." He moved fast. John fired. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder. Briggs fell backward, his torch rolling into the mud, hissing as it died. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They just stood there watching the fire, realizing what they had become. Later, when the flames finally died, Yusuf walked to John and said quietly, "You didn't shoot for me. You shot because you couldn't watch another fire." John didn't answer. He just nodded. As dawn crept over the ruined town, Emma and Amir sat together on the porch steps. Between them, the little wooden bird rested on the rail. Its wings were still uneven, but in the early light, it cast a shadow that looked almost perfect. The fire had devoured everything it touched: walls, memories, names. For days, New Haven smelled of smoke and salt. The wind that used to hum through the valley now carried nothing but the echo of things that were gone. The dead were buried behind the school. Briggs was among them. His grave was small, unmarked, but Yusuf stood there anyway. He didn't pray. He didn't forgive. He just stared at the earth and whispered, "You were human once." Then he walked away. John Weston hadn't spoken since the night of the fire. His voice had turned to gravel, his eyes to ash. Margaret stayed by him, wordless, tending to the burns on his arms, the same hands that had once built their home, their life, their meaning. The settlement was quiet now, not peaceful but hollow. The lines that divided them were gone, erased by fire and grief. Only the people remained. Emma spent her days helping rebuild the school. She painted the walls white again, though the color looked strange under the gray sky. Amir worked beside her, hammering broken wood back into shape. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Every sound, the thud of nails, the scrape of brushes, was a kind of prayer. One afternoon, Yusuf walked into the town square, carrying a shovel. He placed it in front of the well, where the water had long dried up, and started digging. At first, no one helped. They just watched. After a while, John appeared, leaning on his cane. He said nothing, took a second shovel, and began digging beside him. By sunset, the entire town had joined in. Women passed buckets. Children fetched stones. Sweat mixed with dirt, and for the first time in months, no one cared whose hands were touching theirs. By nightfall, water burst through the ground. Muddy, cold, but real. Cheers broke out. Tired, uncertain, but full of something that felt almost like faith. That night, they lit no torches, only candles. The light was soft, golden, and it flickered across faces once hardened by hate. Margaret passed bread around. Layla poured water into cups. Emma and Amir sat by the fire, watching the stars return. John finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I spent half my life fighting a war I thought I understood," he said. "Turns out I was just afraid. Afraid that if I stopped fighting, I'd have to live with what I'd done." No one interrupted. The flames crackled softly. "I killed a man who deserved it," he continued. "But I also killed parts of myself I can't bury. Maybe that's the price. Maybe that's what peace really costs." Yusuf looked up from the fire. "Peace isn't free," he said, "but it's cheaper than hate." The words lingered in the night like a confession. Days turned into weeks. The settlement slowly changed. Fences were taken down. Fields were shared. Children played without fear of names or accents. Sometimes they found bits of old metal in the dirt, bullet casings, dog tags, broken badges. They didn't know what they were. They just tossed them aside and kept playing. Winter came again, softer this time. Snow fell over the rebuilt roofs, over the graves, over the memories that refused to die. And sometimes, on still nights when the stars were clear, you could almost hear it, the faint rustle of wings over the water, carrying the last trace of the fire that had burned them all clean.